Hi, this is Mr. Gideon. We're going to talk about how demand changes. Something that's really important that people easily confuse is that there's two different ways that demand can change. Same thing applies to supply, we'll get to that later. But one way that demand can change is going from one quantity demanded to another quantity demanded, which is shown by sliding along a curve from one point to another as price changes over here. That is different than a change in demand. A change in quantity demanded is going from one point to another and sliding along an existing curve, but a change in demand is where something besides the price of that product or service has changed and caused the demand for that product or service to have to be represented completely differently. At all those previous prices, now we have a completely new curve. In this example, we're going to shift the curve to the right and redraw it as D sub 2. Our original curve is D sub 1, and that's a change in demand, which is an increase in demand. You could also have your original curve D1 be drawn to the left of its starting point and label that new curve D sub 2. That would be a change in demand, which is specifically a decrease in demand. But these are two different things. It's really important to understand the difference. So if we're talking about a change in demand and a curve being completely redrawn over to the right or to the left of its starting point, usually this is how it's represented. You might have a curve that's actually a straight line, or have a curve that's curvy in nature. But if you're going to draw a graph of any kind, you have as your starting point price on this axis, quantity down here as this axis. And we don't typically draw demand and supply curves of any kind that have dots on them. There are some exceptions throughout the course that you'll see, but this simplified version is usually the one that we go with to show theories and models. Here's an example with some actual information going to the example of the demand for coffee beans. Right, so in 2002, using this example, this could have been the original demand curve showing the quantities that would be demanded of coffee beans in billions of pounds at all these different price points. Right, at a price point of $1.75 per pound, we would have had 7.1 billion pounds of coffee demanded in 2002. At a different price point, let's say $1 per pound, more would be demanded, in this case 10 billion pounds. But something else happens between 2002 and 2006 that causes the entire curve to get redrawn with all of these price points. So now at $1, we're not talking about a quantity demanded of 10 billion pounds, but of 12. Something significant changed and caused a change in demand, or the entire curve to be redrawn to the right. So what are these factors that can cause a demand curve to shift and have to get redrawn? These are all factors besides the price of that product or service changing. They are changes in income, preferences, prices of related goods and services, the number of buyers, and even expectations of future price. So let's talk about these. First of all, changes in income. Right, if incomes increase or decrease amongst the people that would want to demand a product or service, that could cause them to want to demand more or less of it, of course. Right, so what do you think, going back to our oversimplified demand curve, would happen if this is the demand curve, D sub 1, for iPhones, and the incomes of the people who are in the market to buy the iPhone increase? Well, that's going to affect the demand curve for the iPhone so that it's redrawn to the right, and you're going to have an increase in the demand for iPhones, ceteris paribus, assuming nothing else changes that could affect this scenario, right? Remember that. When we're talking about theories and models, even as simple as the law of demand, we're oversimplifying, and we always kind of keep in the back of our mind ceteris paribus, assuming nothing else changes. What if incomes decrease? If incomes decrease, nothing else changes, then the demand for iPhones will also decrease, and the entire curve will shift to the left and have to be redrawn. Preferences. Think about something that suddenly becomes popular. perhaps reaches a tipping point in the marketplace in terms of interest in buying that thing. Maybe something that you felt like you had to have when you were younger. A Nano-Pet, a Tamagotchi, baseball trading cards, the latest video game. There's so many different things that get marketed to kids, of course. And when it reaches its zenith, or it's something that's really popular and it hits the peak of its popularity, then that would cause the demand for that thing. Let's say, oh, it's a demand curve for Tickle Me Elmo Extreme, would cause that demand curve to be shifted to the right and redrawn. If something suddenly becomes yesterday, out of date, less popular, the demand curve for that product or service will shift to the left. So those are examples of preferences. Think of them as fads a lot of times. Number of buyers, very simple. If more buyers come into the market, there are more potential demanders of a product or service, then the demand curve is going to shift to the right. If there are fewer buyers compared to where there were in the past, some people say, I'm not in the market for a phone anymore. Then the demand curve for that phone would shift to the left and be redrawn over there. That would be a decrease in demand. Expectations of future price. Let's say you demand an iPhone, the latest version of the iPhone. We'll go back to our example. And you have the money, you have the willingness and ability, but you believe that 3 months from now that iPhone is going to be much less expensive than it is today. What do you and other like-minded people think you might do in terms of the demand for that iPhone today? If you think the price is going to go down 3 months from now, you might hold back and decrease the amount in the marketplace that is demanded today. So that would cause a shift to the left. If you felt like prices of that iPhone or anything else that you were going to demand would be going up 3 months from now, you might start to stock up, and that would cause the demand curve to shift to the right and be redrawn in that direction, because we'd have an increase in demand today since people want to stock up before the prices increase. So those are examples of expectations of future price. The last one we'll talk about has to do with prices of related goods, specifically substitutes and complements. So a substitute is something that is competition. Let's say we're sticking with the example of iPhones, and a competitor is the BlackBerry. What do you think would happen to the demand curve for iPhones if the BlackBerry became significantly cheaper than it is right now? Well, the demand curve would shift to the left for iPhones, because some of those demanders of iPhones would now go and buy BlackBerries. Let's say that the opposite happened, then the demand curve for the iPhone would shift to the right, because now it's a better deal compared to BlackBerry, right? So those are examples of substitutes. Complements are the opposite. Compliments are not the kind that you might think of normally, where you say, hey, you're looking great today, or nice job in that game. Not that kind of compliment. Items are what we're referring to. So items that are bought together. Sticking with our iPhone example, maybe we're thinking about the demand curve for iPhone cases. And that's what this represents. What do you think would happen to the demand curve for iPhone cases if the price of the iPhone goes down? Shift to the right and redrawn in that direction, because you'd have more people willing to buy more of both, especially if you're buying them as a package. What's another example of complements? Oh, how about hot dogs and hot dog buns? Raise your hand if you've ever watched Father of the Bride, the more recent version. Came out, oh gosh, how long ago was it? 15 years ago, maybe, with Steve Martin. And if you've seen that movie, it's a great movie. There's a key scene in there where Steve Martin, who is the father of the bride, kind of loses his mind. If you haven't seen it, it's okay, but there's this one scene as the movie builds and all the expenses for the wedding are mounting on Steve Martin, where he kind of loses his mind, and he's in the supermarket, and one of the clerks finds him on one of these aisles ripping open bags of hot dog buns. And the guy goes, sir, what are you doing? And Steve Martin goes, you want to know what I'm doing? I'll tell you what I'm doing. You ever notice that when you go to the supermarket and you need to buy hot dogs and hot dog buns, that they don't come in the same amounts? If I want to buy 8 hot dogs and 8 hot dog buns, I don't have that as an option. I have to buy 12 of one and 8 of the other. Why? Because some big shot at the bun company got together with some big shot over at the wiener company and decided to rip off the American public. So I'm removing the superfluous buns. He's right. These are complementary items. You don't typically go to the market and just buy the buns, toast them, and eat them by themselves. You buy these things together. And so if the price of one decreases or increases, it can affect the demand of its complementary item. So those are complements and substitutes. Another thing that can be a little confusing to people is the difference between normal goods and inferior goods. Normal goods are the goods that we prefer. And so when it comes to incomes, and I was saying before how if incomes rise, they're going to buy more of the good that they want. That's true for normal goods. It would be the opposite for an inferior good. So if incomes go up, since people are going to want to buy the normal thing more frequently, that is their top choice, let's say, the demand for the inferior good will decrease. Now, if you're selling a cheap knockoff of some kind or an inferior good and incomes go down, people are going to want to buy the cheaper thing, typically, in order to save money. And so the demand curve for the inferior good would shift to the right, demand would increase, and the demand curve for the normal good would shift to the left and decrease. So those are factors that would change demand. And when we talk about a change in demand, remember the entire curve gets redrawn. That's different than a change in quantity demanded, where price for that good or service changes and causes us to slide from one point to another along the curve.